Welcome back to the deep dive. Our mission today, well, it's pretty vital. We're diving into your microbiology sources to figure out how pathogens actually manage to get past the defenses of the central nervous system. Think of it as a biological fortress.
It really is. Probably the most protected space in the entire body.
Yeah, so we want to pull out those core scientific ideas, the actual mechanisms of infection, and importantly, the key terms you really need to know for recognizing these critical situations in healthcare.
Absolutely. We're talking about the nervous system, both the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system. It needs to be kept almost sterile. The body throws up multiple layers of defense because any inflammation or infection there is just catastrophic.
And those defenses are really quite impressive. We've got that three-layer armor, the meninges, and then this super selective filter, the blood-brain barrier. We're going to unpack how invaders, everything from bacteria with chemical tricks to weird misfolded proteins, manage to find ways through. Okay, let's start with the basic layout, the architecture. CNS is brain and spinal cord. PNS is basically all the nerves branching off cranial nerves, spinal nerves, ganglia. And covering the CNS, you have those three membranes, right?
That's right. The duramater, that's the tough outer one. Then the arachnoid layer in the middle, kind of web-like.
Phytoweb-like, yeah.
And then the piamater, which is really delicate, right up against the brain and spinal cord tissue.
So strong physical layers, but then there's the fluid.
Right. The cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, flows in the space under the arachnoid layer, the subarachnoid space. It cushions the brain, which is vital.
But there's a catch, isn't there, with the CSF?
There is. It's intentionally kept low in immune components. You find very low levels of antibodies, complement proteins, phagocytic cells, the stuff that usually fights infection.
So if something does get through the outer layers,
it finds this great environment to multiply in. Very little resistance once it's in the CSF.
a perfect storm waiting to happen. But first, they have to get past that main gatekeeper, the blood-brain barrier.
Ah, the BBB. It's basically formed by specialized capillaries in the brain. And they are incredibly restrictive about what they let pass from the blood into the brain tissue itself.
The general rule being?
Generally, only things that are lipid-soluble can cross easily. There are, of course, specific carriers for essentials the brain needs, like glucose and certain amino acids. But otherwise, it's locked down tight.
And this has huge implications for treatment, right? Like with antibiotics.
Exactly. The sources point this out clearly.
Yeah.
Take chloramphenicol. It's highly lipid-soluble, so it gets into the brain pretty readily. But then look at penicillin. It's only slightly lipid-soluble. To get enough penicillin into the brain to fight an infection, you often need massive doses.
Which brings its own risks systemically.
Absolutely. So the BBB doesn't just protect, it forces really tough clinical choices, huge doses with toxicity risks, or maybe switching to a drug that gets in better but might not be the best drug for the bug itself.
It's a real balancing act, and this amazing barrier can still be breached, often because of inflammation.
Precisely. If you get inflammation, say meningitis, inflammation of the meninges, or encephalitis, inflammation of the brain itself.
Or both, meningoencephalitis.
Right. That inflammation can actually damage the integrity of the BBB, make it leaky.
Allowing things through that normally wouldn't get anywhere near the brain tissue.
Including pathogens. Which leads us neatly into diagnosis, using CSF analysis. How do we tell the difference quickly between, say, a viral meningitis and a much more urgent bacterial one?
Okay, this is key.
It really comes down to two things initially. How cloudy the CSF looks, and what type of white blood cells are showing up. Remember this. Septic meningitis usually means bacterial. The CSF will look turbid, cloudy, thick.
Why cloudy?
Because there's a huge, rapid influx of granulocytes, a type of white blood cell fighting the bacteria. Protein levels also shoot up fast.
And aseptic.
Aseptic meningitis is more often viral. The CSF usually stays clear. You still get an increase in white blood cells, but it's slower, and it's mainly lymphocytes and monocytes. Protein increase is usually slight.
So that immediate look at the CSF, cloudy versus clear, and the cell type tells you whether to hit the panic button for broad-spectrum antibiotics right away.
Exactly. Bacterial meningitis is a true medical emergency.
And quickly, the main ways these pathogens get in, you mentioned the bloodstream.
Yeah, the most common routes are via the bloodstream or the lymphatic system, especially if the BBB is already compromised by inflammation somewhere else in the body.
But there's that other sneaky route, too.
Yes. Don't forget that some viruses can actually travel directly up peripheral nerves. They bypass the blood road altogether. We'll see how important that is when we talk about rabies.
Okay, so barriers can be breached physically, but some bacteria don't need to breach the fortress walls themselves. They use chemical warfare, neurotoxins, Let's start with tetanus.
Clostridium tetani. Gram-positive rod, anaerobic, and it forms that characteristic spore that looks a bit like a drumstick. Terminal spore.
And those spores are everywhere, right? Soil.
Ubiquitous, especially common in soil that's been treated with manure. But here's the interesting part about tetanus. It's really an intoxication, not so much a spreading infection.
What do you mean? The bacteria get in a wound.
They do, often a deep puncture wound where there's not much oxygen. But the bacteria themselves tend to stay put right there in the wound tissue. They don't typically spread through the body.
So it's not the bacteria causing the widespread problem?
No, it's the toxin they produce. A ridiculously potent neurotoxin called tetanospasmin. This toxin gets released locally. Then it travels likely via peripheral nerves, maybe the bloodstream too, up to the central nervous system.
And once it gets to the CNS?
It does something very specific. It blocks the release of inhibitory neurotransmitters. These are the chemical signals that normally tell muscles to relax after contracting.
So you block the relax signal.
And you get uncontrolled continuous muscle contraction. That's tetany. The classic sign is trismus, or lockjaw, which is often the first symptom people notice in the most common form. Generalized tetanus, about 80% of cases.
Are there other types?
Yeah, briefly, there's local tetanus near the wound, cephalic tetanus affecting cranial nerves, and neonatal tetanus, which is devastating, usually from infection of the umbilical stump before it heals.
Nasty stuff.
Yeah.
And now let's flip to the other Clostridium that causes havoc with nerves. Botulism. Clostridium botulism.
Another anaerobic spore-forming rod. And this one produces what's often called the most potent natural toxin known, especially type A, incredibly lethal even in minuscule amounts. We're talking nanograms.
And its mechanism is different from tetanus.
Completely the opposite in effect. If tetanus toxin blocks the stop signal, causing muscles to seize up, spastic paralysis.
Botulinum toxin blocks the go signal.
Exactly. The botulinum toxin gets to the neuromuscular junction where the nerve tells the muscle fiber to contract, and it physically prevents the release of the main excitatory neurotransmitter, which is acetylcholine.
No, acetylcholine means?
No muscle contraction at all. This causes flaccid paralysis. Muscles go limp. It typically starts with the muscles controlled by cranial nerves, face, eyes, swallowing, and then descends down the body.
Affecting breathing muscles eventually.
Yes, and that's the killer. Without antitoxin treatment and mechanical ventilation to help the patient breathe, the mortality rate is very high. It's, again, an intoxication. You ingest the preformed toxin, usually in improperly preserved food, rather than getting infected by the bacteria itself, mostly.
Though infant botulism is different, right? Spores in the gut.
Infant botulism is an exception, yes, where spores colonize the immature gut. But for adults, it's usually the toxin itself. And of course, tiny controlled doses of this toxin are used cosmetically.
Botox. Relaxing facial muscles to reduce wrinkles.
The very same mechanism, localized flaccid paralysis.
Okay, moving from toxins back to direct bacterial infections causing meningitis. There are three main players historically, the meningitis trio.
Right. First up, Streptococcus pneumonia, or pneumococcal meningitis. Because of the success of the Hib vaccine, this one is now the most common cause in adults, the elderly, and also young kids. It also causes things like ear infections, otitis media.
And the big worry with this one?
Antibiotic resistance. We're seeing more and more strains that are tough to treat with standard antibiotics.
Okay, number two.
Neisseria meningitis, meningococcal meningitis, often called the dorm disease because it can spread quickly in close quarters like college dorms or military barracks.
How does it spread?
Respiratory droplets, sneezing, coughing, and a lot of people, maybe up to 20% of us, can carry it in our nose and throat without getting sick asymptomatic carriers.
But when it does cause disease?
It comes on fast, maybe 1 to 3 days incubation, and it can cause septicemia infection in the blood, leading to a characteristic hemorrhagic rash, little pinpoint bleeds under the skin, very dangerous, progresses rapidly.
And the third one, you mentioned the vaccine success.
Yes, Haemophilus influenza type B, or Hib, used to be the leading cause of bacterial meningitis in young children. But the Hib conjugate vaccine has been incredibly effective. We've seen like a 95% or more reduction in cases, a real public health triumph.
That's amazing, a huge impact. Now let's talk about a different kind of bacterial threat, one known for being foodborne, Listeria monocytogenes.
Listeria. It causes listeriosis, often linked to contaminated deli meats, soft cheeses, things like that. It particularly targets the elderly, pregnant women, and anyone immunocompromised.
What makes it so good at causing serious disease, especially in the CNS?
It has a couple of really clever tricks. First, it can actually live and multiply inside macrophages.
Hiding inside immune cells?
Exactly. It uses them to travel around the body, shielded from other parts of the immune system.
Yeah.
And second, it's small enough and has the mechanisms to cross the placenta.
Which is terrible news for pregnancy.
Devastating. It can cause miscarriage, stillbirth, or severe illness in the newborn, either early onset or late onset disease. It's a major concern in obstetrics.
Okay, one more bacterial one, though it's quite different. Leprosy, or Hansen's disease. Mycobacterium leprae. It affects nerves, but not quite like meningitis.
Right. Leprosy primarily targets the skin and the peripheral nerves, especially in cooler parts of the body, like the hands, feet, face.
And the key problem isn't the bacteria directly destroying tissue, like gangrene, is it?
Not primarily. The main issue is the nerve damage leads to a loss of sensation. Patients lose the ability to feel pain, temperature, or touch in the affected areas.
Which sounds almost good. No pain.
You'd think, but pain is a vital warning signal. Without it, people with leprosy repeatedly injure their hands and feet, burns, cuts, pressure sores without realizing it. It's these repeated unnoticed injuries and the resulting secondary infections that cause the severe tissue damage and disfigurement historically associated with the disease.
A tragic consequence of losing that protective sense of pain.
Okay, let's switch gears to viruses affecting the nervous system. Polio is a big one historically. Poliomyelitis.
Caused by poliovirus. What kind of virus is it?
It's an enterovirus, non-developed single-stranded RNA, usually spreads fecal orally, and actually most infections, maybe 95%, are asymptomatic or just cause mild illness. The virus stays in the gut.
So the paralysis is rare.
Relatively rare, yes. It's almost like an accidental detour for the virus. Occasionally, it manages to get from the gut into the bloodstream and then crosses into the CNS.
And what does it do there?
It specifically targets and destroys motor neurons, the nerve cells in the spinal cord, and brainstem that control muscle movement.
Killing those specific cells leads to paralysis.
Exactly. It can be temporary, but often it's permanent flaccid paralysis. And even years later, survivors can develop post-polio syndrome, new muscle weakness, fatigue, pain in muscles that were previously affected, or even ones that seemed okay.
A long-lasting impact. Now, another virus known for nerve involvement, rabies. You mentioned viruses traveling up nerves earlier.
This is the classic example. The rabies virus itself has a very distinct bullet shape under the microscope. It's zoonotic, transmitted from animals, usually through a bite or scratch.
And how does it reach the brain?
It gets into the peripheral nerves near the bite wound and then travels up the nerve fibers, retrograde transport, all the way to the CNS.
So the incubation period depends on how far it has to travel. Bite on the foot takes longer than a bite on the face.
Generally, yes. Yeah. And that incubation period is the only window for treatment. Because once rabies symptoms appear, anxiety, confusion, paralysis, hydrophobia, it's essentially 100% fatal.
Which is why immediate treatment after potential exposure is so critical.
Absolutely non-negotiable. Post-exposure prophylaxis, or PP. That involves washing the wound thoroughly, giving rabies immunoglobulin around the wound if possible, and starting the rabies vaccine series immediately. It's highly effective if given promptly.
Okay, moving on, there's a whole category called Arboviral Encephalitis. Arbo meaning?
Arthropod-borne. These are viruses transmitted by insects, primarily mosquitoes and ticks. They bite an infected animal or bird, the reservoir host, and then bite a human, transmitting the virus.
And these cause encephalitis brain inflammation, examples in the U.S.
There are several, often named geographically. Eastern equine encephalitis, EEE, Western equine encephalitis, WOW-AA, St. Louis encephalitis, La Crosse encephalitis, and the big one that spread across the country more recently is West Nile virus.
West Nile wasn't originally here, right?
No, it was introduced likely in the late 90s. Birds are the main reservoir. Mosquitoes bite infected birds, then bite humans. It's now found pretty much everywhere in the continental U.S. Most infections are mild, but it can cause serious neuroinvasive disease like meningitis or encephalitis, especially in older adults.
Okay, now, beyond bacteria and viruses, what about fungi and protozoans attacking the CNS?
Generally, these are less common and tend to be opportunistic infections, meaning they primarily cause disease in people whose immune systems are already weakened.
Like with HIV/AIDS or cancer patients?
Exactly, or transplant recipients on immunosuppressive drugs. A key fungal example is Streptococcus neoformans, which causes cryptococcosis, often cryptococcal meningitis. It's associated with soil contaminated with bird droppings, especially pigeon droppings.
And protozoans.
We see trypanosomiasis. There are two main forms caused by different trypanosoma species. African trypanosomiasis, or sleeping sickness, is transmitted by the tsetse fly.
Sleeping sickness leads to coma.
Yes. It progresses through stages, eventually affecting the CNS, causing confusion, sleep disturbances, and finally coma and death if untreated. A really interesting feature is that the organism can change its surface coat proteins repeatedly
Why does it do that?
to evade the host's immune system. Every time the immune system mounts an attack against one surface protein, the parasite switches to a new one. Makes vaccine development incredibly difficult.
Wow. And the other form?
American Trypanosomiasis, or Chagas' disease. Transmitted by the reduvid bug, often called the kissing bug, because it tends to bite people near the mouth while they sleep.
And how does transmission happen?
The bug bites, takes a blood meal, and then often defecates near the bite wound. The trypanosomes are in the feces, and the person often scratches the bite, rubbing the parasites into the wound or mucous membranes like the eye. Chagas can cause acute illness, but often leads to chronic problems years later, particularly heart and digestive issues. CNS involvement is less common than in the African form, but can occur.
Okay, that covers a lot of different invaders. Finally, the strangest category, prions.
Prions are unique. They aren't bacteria, viruses, fungi, or protozoa. They're proteins. Specifically, abnormally folded versions of a normal protein found in the brain.
Just a misfolded protein, how can that be infectious?
That's the terrifying part. This misfolded prion protein, PRPSC, can induce normally folded prion proteins, PRPC, to misfold into the abnormal shape. It starts a chain reaction, a cascade of misfolding, accumulation of these abnormal proteins, formation of amyloid plaques, and destruction of brain tissue, leaving characteristic sponge-like holes. That's why they're called transmissible spongiform encephalopathies, or TSEs.
And these are always fatal.
Always. And progressive. Examples in humans include Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, CJD, variant CJD linked to mad cow disease, Kuru, linked to ritualistic cannibalism in Papua New Guinea, Gersman-Streusler-Scheinker syndrome, and fatal familial insomnia.
They have long incubation periods, right?
Often very long, years or even decades. But once symptoms start, typically things like rapid dementia, memory loss, personality changes, movement problems, the disease progresses quickly, usually leading to death within months to a year or two. And they are incredibly hard to destroy. Normal sterilization methods don't work well on prions. Hack, tag, tag, outro.
So wrapping this up, what we've really seen today is how the nervous system relies heavily on its physical defenses, those meninges, that highly selective blood-brain barrier.
Absolutely. And infections generally succeed either by finding specific ways around those barriers, like traveling up nerves, or by using incredibly powerful chemical weapons, those neurotoxins we discussed. It's often about strategy, not just brute force.
And for healthcare professionals listening, the critical takeaway.
I think it's understanding the mechanism. Knowing how the pathogen works tells you what to look for and how to intervene. Is it bacterial meningitis needing immediate antibiotics? You look for that cloudy CSF, those granulocytes. Is it botulism with that descending flaccid paralysis? Then you need antitoxin and respiratory support, fast. Is it likely viral? Then treatment might be more supportive. The mechanism guides the diagnosis and the treatment. Timing is absolutely critical with CNS infections.
Understanding the how leads to the what next. Okay, so for our final provocative thought, we've talked about the CNS being this protected space, almost walled off. But new research is kind of challenging that view.
Yeah, there's this really interesting concept emerging called the inflammatory reflex. It involves the neuroimmune axis, the idea that the nervous system isn't just passively sitting behind its barriers.
It's actively involved in immunity.
Exactly. Research suggests the brain, through nerves like the vagus nerve, can actually sense inflammation elsewhere in the body and actively send signals back to modulate the immune response. For instance, helping to control levels of inflammatory cytokines like TNF-alpha.
So the fortress might actually have guards patrolling outside the walls too, managing the overall defense system.
In a manner of speaking, yes. It suggests a much more dynamic interplay between the nervous and immune systems than we previously thought. It just shows how much we're still learning about how this incredibly complex system protects itself and interacts with the rest of the body. Always more to discover.
A fascinating area for future research. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into how microbes breach the nervous system's defenses.
We really hope this breakdown of the chapter was useful for your studies and understanding.
We'll catch you on the next deep dive.
And here is a warm thank you from the Last Minute Lecture team.